Good morning. My name is John Drake, and I'm the Chamber's Executive Director for Supply Chain Policy. I am pleased to introduce you all to our keynote speaker this morning, Ms. Jolene Hollis. Jolene is a survivor leader, consultant, trainer, and social justice advocate. This morning, you will hear her story of the 10 years she spent being trafficked in the commercial sex industry, her escape, and her insights on combating trafficking. Her story is a powerful reminder that human trafficking happens close to home and often in the open, but it's also a story of the small things that can help those caught in trafficking and their lives after. I want to thank Jolene for making the trip from California to be with us this morning and for sharing her story with us today. Jolene?
Thank you, John, and thank you for the Chamber for having me today. I want to take the time also to thank you guys for being here and being involved in this issue. As John mentioned, I was trafficked in the commercial sex industry from 2004 to 2013 in approximately 13 states and 48 cities. During this time, I accumulated about 12 arrests, primarily for prostitution. I do want to acknowledge that my arrests are very low due to the amount of time I was trafficked compared to my peers of color. My criminalization affected my recovery and added to the trauma and distrust in authorities that I had already experienced. So how did I get here today? I'll just start with a piece of my background. I grew up in Turlock, California, a small country town located an hour and a half outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. My parents met in college at Fresno State and married shortly after. My mother graduated. My mother escaped an abusive childhood herself, and that abuse continued until she was 21. After that, my mother entered an abusive relationship with my father. Never recognizing or processing her abuse. So my mother was also the primary breadwinner in our family, working as a registered nurse and also teaching the nursing program in our local community college. Due to the abuse of my father, my parents got divorced when I was about 9 years old. I was the only child to witness the abuse between my parents, and I was also the only child of 3 to be verbally, physically, and emotionally abused by my father. But the violence didn't stop after the divorce, it continued. The abuse I encountered also was never discussed for face value. No one ever believed me, and I didn't have the language to understand and process. This caused me to live a very broken and confused life, causing a series of traumatic events until I was 27 and decided to heal. My mother and I had a very dysfunctional relationship growing up. She spent her time trying to find out what was wrong with me, and I spent my time running away from the continued violence in my home. My older brother, however, was the golden child, 3-sport athlete, and went on to West Point on a wrestling scholarship. My younger sister is 6 years younger. She also went on to college immediately after high school. She was also very sheltered from the abuse in our home. So I struggled in school. I struggled with PTSD, making it hard for me to focus and be successful. I had a tough time building healthy relationships. I started engaging in smoking pot and sexual activity when I was in the 7th grade. Despite being an exceptional athlete, it wasn't enough for me to stay in school, so I dropped out and began my journey through the juvenile justice system, in and out of juvenile hall and juvenile programs. I did, however, graduate from high school, and after I graduated, I left my mother's house to stay with friends and wherever I could. Desperate to succeed, I rode the Amtrak to Southern California in hopes to stay with my family and attend college. My family, however, did not exactly agree to this, and I headed back to Turlock after a few days. On my way home, I met my first pimp at Union Station in Los Angeles. He eventually became the father of my daughter. I was coerced into thinking His drug dealing would support me and I would be safe. In less than 24 hours after meeting him, I had a gun to my head and was forced to work the track in Fresno, California. We eventually ended up in Las Vegas, Nevada, where I was arrested multiple times and encountered some of the worst violence in my life. After 2 years, I had finally had enough. My last arrest was there in Las Vegas was when I was 4 months pregnant. When I got released, I left with whatever I could carry in the middle of the night, and I took the Amtrak back home. He followed me not long after and continued the abuse, breaking my nose and leaving me in the hospital when I was 6 months pregnant. He ended up going to prison when my daughter was 8 months old, where he remains to this day for charges unrelated to any of his trafficking. So I started going to school. I started working at a dual diagnosis program for mentally ill and homeless individuals. I was never identified as a victim. I was never addressed what I had experienced, and so I still struggled. The only thing I ever was identified as is a victim of domestic violence and a prostitute. So I went through an intensive perinatal program. Again, never really addressing what we now and what I now am able to identify as sex trafficking. I decided I was ready to date, so I went on an online dating site where I met my second trafficker and encountered him. He was what we could call a CEO pimp, and I was intrigued by his fancy things and quickly began to work for him. The first night I worked for him, I made $1,500. This was enough to pay my rent and bills for the month. As a single mother, going to school full-time and working 2 jobs to support my daughter, this was very intriguing. So I thought I would be able to finish college, provide for my daughter without struggle. I eventually quit my job, dropped out of school, and placed my daughter with my mother. I began to work an East Coast circuit, working as a high-end call girl. I was living the good life, I thought. I was in fancy cars, nice hotels, 5-star dinners. On a bad day, I would make around $1,000, and on a good day, I'd make upwards to $5,000. Things were not as they seemed, though. Every dollar I made, I handed over for safety and savings, I thought. When I tried to leave, I was told I could leave with what I came with, nothing. I wasn't abused physically or mentally, but the coercion was much more difficult to bear. It took me 2 years and 17 attempts before I left for good, with nothing. March 31st, 2013 was the day I decided to not go back to him. For the next year, I worked as what they call a renegade. That's somebody that works in the commercial sex industry without a pimp or trafficker. My last arrest was December 10th, 2013, and the long journey from there, it was a long journey from that time to where I stand in front of you today. I don't know how I could have done it without the help from my church and my community. I created. I endured great shame, rejection, hurt, judgment, and a lot of misguided anger. It took me 6 months before I had the courage to go in public without fear and look for work, a legal job. What would I tell an employer? What was my gap in employment? Who would hire an ex-prostitute with active warrants? Because that's what society said I was. Desperate to find other women like me, I created a support group in my church where we processed our trauma and connected with each other through our faith. This was one of the most powerful experiences in my healing journey. In 2015, I started working in social services, and even through the organizations that started to realize there was a need for specialized services, very few focused solely on serving human trafficking victims, particularly when it comes to housing and shelter. In September of 2018, CAST opened the first emergency shelter for human trafficking in Los Angeles County, where I'm currently employed. As well as working at CAST, I have finally returned to school, focusing on holistic health. I will be starting school in fall to complete a master's program in acupuncture therapy, which I will use to help heal trauma. My life goal is to be able to send my daughter to college, equipped and knowledgeable about the world and safe from trafficking. It is also to be able to open up a healing center where we can focus on addressing the traumas that women endure while being trafficked. So what is CAST? CAST stands for the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. It was founded in 1998. There was actually a large Thai labor trafficking case in Los Angeles County where a group of 72 Thai workers had been kept in slavery for about 7 years. So CAST formed to support and guide these victims of labor trafficking through their freedom. Today, CAST serves both labor and sex trafficking. We provide emergency response 24/7 and long-term supportive services, including our 24-hour hotline, social service case management, legal services, shelter, training and outreach, public policy, and my favorite part is our leadership program. CAST hosts what we call the National Survivor Network. The National Survivor Network is a survivor-led network that brings together a community of survivors to support and encourage each other to realize to learn the value and insight, not just as survivors, but as experts in the field of human trafficking. The NSN has members from various backgrounds, or ranging from 24 countries and 32 states. So the next question is, what can businesses do? What can faith-based organizations do to help eradicate human trafficking? In my church, we have a human trafficking ministry, which supports not only the local nonprofits, but NGOs as well, providing material, support, and at times transportation to survivors. We also host survivor support groups as well. Our church has also created a training video and module of how you can start a ministry in your community or your church. Consider employing survivors. The big thing is once we rescue girls, which we tried to deter from using the word rescue, but once a girl or individual exits the life of human trafficking, what is next? How do you move forward when you escape with the clothes on your back? Most of the time when individuals come to our shelter, they come with what they have on, and that's it. And so it is our job to walk them through the process of their first 90 days of recovery and help them build a new life. So employment is something that is very difficult for them to do. So I really encourage you as businesses in this area or in this community and involved in this issue to look at what does it take to employ a survivor? What does it take to support somebody after they leave the life, and how do they move forward? Connect with your local nonprofits and provide services, and donate supplies to shelters and organizations. I'd like to close with this as well, and I really appreciate Nikki from UPS. Speaking up on the demand side, last night as I scrolled through Facebook, I saw a quote from one of my colleagues and survivor leaders, Autumn Burse, and she stated, "There's not always a trafficker, but there's always a buyer." So we cannot combat sex trafficking unless we start to really bring into the conversation the demand. So I challenge you as businesses to also start training and talking about the demand piece as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Jolene, would you be comfortable taking a few questions from the audience? Is that all right? Thank you. Anybody?
First of all, thank you for sharing your story. I know how difficult that can be. One of the policy issues that we're looking at trying to implement, you mentioned employment. I've also heard that there's a huge, when someone is trafficked, they also have their identity stolen. Their social security numbers, the pimps and others use those to open up credit cards and don't pay them off. So when someone tries to get a job and they run a credit check on them, their credit is just a complete mess. And maybe part of the conversation you can have with the business community is how do we address that issue so you can get a job, you can get a credit, you can get good credit again.
And
it wasn't your fault, it was
Yeah.
somebody taking advantage of your information.
Definitely. So part of the National Survivor Network is we have a policy team, which is a group of survivors that actually creates, we also have a legal team, so we have lawyers that work alongside of us as well, and we create and lobby for bills to be passed. So I'd love to connect with you and see if you have something drafted or how we could support as a survivor network moving forward with that. So it's definitely an important thing, and not just employment, but housing as well. I mean, when you leave a situation and you have nothing, where do you go? How do you stay? I mean, one of the questions when we first started talking about human trafficking was, why don't they just leave? But the question is, leave to where? Leave to who? And how do you move forward once you leave? So that's a very important issue when we talk about recovery. Well, thank you.
Hi, Wendy Banyaska from Caesars Entertainment. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for being here with us today. I was curious about the faith, your faith organization and the spreading awareness of how to create ministries within people's own organizations. Is that an awareness building that is sort of designed to go to any sort of religious organization? What does it request that people sort of come to you within their own organization who are already members? I'm really interested.
So we actually just finished filming and creating a video module, and all of our resources are free. So we're continuing to create and develop, basically just sharing what we've done and our experiences. As we know, when we're working with survivors and in this movement, everything changes, right? Sometimes statistics are focused on one demographic, and sometimes we need to focus on another demographic. So we always say, if you're gonna do this work, be open to change. Excuse me. So those are available, and I would love to connect with you and give you the website. The church that I'm involved with is Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, California, and somewhere through the website is a link where you could find those training models. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolene.